Have you ever wondered why you never felt pulled toward basketball, even when the whole world around you seemed to revolve around it? You stand in a room where people talk about last night's game with bright eyes and loud laughter, and you feel that strange softness inside you, a quiet space that doesn't move with their excitement. You smile, you nod, you listen, but there's a faint sense of distance, like you're behind a glass wall watching everyone else speak a language you were never taught. And in that moment, you don't feel superior or indifferent. You simply feel different, as if your inner world was shaped by a rhythm the crowd doesn't hear. Maybe you remember being a child, sitting in a classroom where other kids argued passionately about players and scores, while you traced shapes on your notebook or stared out the window, drawn to the sky instead of the scoreboard. You didn't hate the game, you just didn't feel anything when others did. Your mind wandered towards stories, or silence, or ideas that no one else seemed to care about. And slowly, without noticing, you learned to hide that difference. You learned to pretend, to nod along, to make your curiosity smaller so you didn't stand out. As you grew older, this quiet separation didn't disappear. It simply turned into a kind of emotional muscle memory. Your brain, shaped by years of seeking comfort in solitude or imagination, didn't light up at the sound of whistles, sneakers, or roaring crowds. Neuroscience would say your dopamine pathways were carved differently, that certain stimuli never became rewarding because they were never linked to safety, connection, or joy in the first place. Psychology would say your temperament leans inward, anchored in reflection rather than adrenaline. And your heart would probably say you were never part of the world that found meaning in competition, performance, or collective excitement. But you've carried a quieter truth too, the unspoken guilt. That small ache of not fitting into something that everyone else seems to belong to. You tell yourself it's just a sport, but deep down, you feel the subtle pressure of culture, expectation, and belonging. You wonder why you don't connect. You wonder if something is wrong with you for not feeling what others feel. Yet the truth is far more human, far more intimate than any rulebook or scoreboard could explain. Because not watching basketball is almost never about the sport. It's about identity. It's about childhood wiring. It's about emotional temperament and the invisible threads that shape the way your mind engages with the world. And before you can understand why you stand outside the noise of the arena, you must understand where this story truly began. Have you ever noticed how the things you care about today often feel like echoes from a childhood you don't fully remember? It starts quietly, long before you ever hear a crowd roar or see a ball arc through the air. You begin life not as a blank slate, but as a small, sensitive creature scanning the world for signals of safety, love, and belonging. And the way those signals show up or fail to becomes the blueprint for what you later move toward and what you instinctively turn away from. Maybe you were the child who grew up in a home where noise meant tension, raised voices, slammed doors, the unpredictable emotional storms of distant or distracted parents. In that world, competition didn't look like excitement, it felt like danger. The sound of people shouting, even in celebration, blended into the same frequency as conflict. Your nervous system learned early that loudness was not joy, but threat. So, without even knowing it, you drifted toward quieter places, toward the sanctuary of your room, where you could line up your toys just right, or draw shapes that made sense when people didn't. Or perhaps you were the child who found comfort in stillness, building things alone, wandering through imagination, reading stories that opened quiet doors in your mind. You didn't crave the energy of a team. You craved the soft rhythm of your own thoughts. Neuroscience would say your dopamine system tuned itself to introspection, not stimulation. Studies show that by age 7, the brain already begins pairing certain environments with emotional meaning, joy with silence, comfort with solitude, safety with predictability. And if basketball was never part of that ecosystem, it never became part of your identity. Maybe your home celebrated sports, but not in a way that made you feel seen. Maybe a parent praised the sibling who could run fast, who could shoot well, who could impress the relatives. And you, the thinker, the dreamer, the quiet child with a world inside your head, felt invisible in the shadow of applause meant for someone else. You learned that physical expression wasn't your language. Nobody watered that garden. Nobody sat beside you long enough to notice what you were actually good at. So the world of sports became a place where you weren't enough, or weren't chosen, or weren't understood. And so the identity seed was planted quietly, subtly, naturally. A seed that told you where you belonged and where you didn't, what felt like home and what felt like exile. And then the child grows up and learns to wear the mask. Have you ever noticed how, as you grow older, your silence becomes a kind of costume? Not a loud declaration of who you are, but a soft, protective layer you've learned to wear in rooms where your inner world doesn't match the rhythm around you. You step into adulthood carrying the echoes of a childhood that shaped you, and without realizing it, you begin to move through life as an observer, someone who watches more than they join, someone who lives inwardly, even when the world demands outward excitement. You sit at work while co-workers argue passionately about last night's MVP performance, and you feel that familiar distance settle over you. You smile because it's polite. You nod because it's expected. But inside, there's an empty space where their enthusiasm should resonate. Not because you're cold or uninterested in people, but because the emotional wiring that shapes your joy was never built around cheering crowds or competitive energy. Your brain was sculpted for depth, not noise, for reflection, not adrenaline. And so you put on what feels like a mask of neutrality, a face that protects you from the subtle judgment that comes when you don't share the passions everyone else seems to have inherited. On dates, the script repeats itself. Someone asks, "So, you watch basketball, right?" The question is so casual, so automatic, as if saying no would somehow make you less normal, less connected, less culturally fluent. And you feel that small tug inside the shadow of disinterest you've learned to keep hidden, because it feels too revealing, too different. So you soften the truth, make a joke, or redirect the conversation. Not out of shame, but because you've learned that people often misunderstand quiet preferences as a lack of personality rather than a different kind of inner life. Even in family gatherings, when everyone is gathered around the television and the living room glows with the colours of the game, you find yourself drifting to the background. You refill drinks, pretend to check your phone, or simply stand at the edge of the room, hoping your quiet absence doesn't draw attention. You don't resent the game, you just don't belong to the emotional world it creates. It feels like being invited to a celebration where your heart cannot follow the music. So you craft a private inner court where the game is played silently, where your interests, your mind, your values can exist without friction. And over time, you convince yourself that your indifference is simply a preference, when in truth, it's a reflection of deeper, emotional patterns formed long before adulthood began. And beneath that mask, a question begins to rise, one that leads straight into the psychology behind all of this. Have you ever wondered why something as simple as a sport can feel like it belongs to an entirely different world? A world that calls others with undeniable force, yet leaves you untouched. The answer isn't preference or personality alone. It is something deeper, older, carved into the architecture of your mind long before you knew what a free throw was. Attraction to a hobby, a rhythm, a community is not random. It is the nervous system choosing what feels like home. Some people are born with what psychologist Marvin Zuckerman called a sensation-seeking temperament, a brain hungry for stimulation, noise, adrenaline, and quick bursts of reward. For them, basketball is electricity, a moving storm of sound and bodies, the promise of collective excitement, and their brain lights up accordingly, releasing dopamine in perfect synchrony with the roar of the arena. But your wiring may be different. You might carry what research calls a low stimulation temperament, where the nervous system finds calm in soft spaces and slow thoughts, avoiding anything that overwhelms the senses. Your brain does not chase intensity, it seeks coherence, meaning, control. Mirror neurons, the circuits that help you feel what others feel, play their part too. Some people see an athlete sprint down a court, and their body responds, muscles tightening, heart rising, breath aligning. Their brain recognizes movement as emotional language. But your mirror neurons might be tuned to subtler worlds, stillness, observation, depth. Where others feel the pulse of physical action, you feel the pulse of inner imagery, imagination, or thinking. One isn't better, they are simply different emotional dialects. Even attachment theory leaves its fingerprints here. If your early environment made group energy feel unpredictable, unsafe, or overwhelming, your adult brain may instinctively avoid crowd culture. Basketball isn't just a game. It becomes a symbolic landscape of shouting, urgency, and high stakes. The very sensations a sensitive nervous system learned to protect itself from. So your brain chooses a different reward pathway. While others feel dopamine from competition and connection, you feel it from the quiet mastery of personal interests, from the gentle satisfaction of understanding something deeply, from the safety of solitude. Your cognitive identity aligns with what mirrors your internal world. You walk toward whatever feels like you and away from what doesn't. And this is why you don't watch basketball. Not because of the game, but because the emotional universe it represents never aligned with the universe inside you. But every preference carries a shadow, an unseen cost, a quieter ache, loneliness that grows in the spaces where the world celebrates without you. And that shadow leads us into the darker side of this story. Have you ever felt the quiet ache of standing among people who seem effortlessly connected to a world you've never belonged to? It's subtle at first, almost invisible. A group of friends laughing over last night's game, trading names and plays like a shared language, a language you were never taught. You laugh with them, but it's a delayed, hollow sound because you're responding to their energy, not to the thing that created it. And slowly, you begin to sense it, the shadow of not belonging, the soft darkness that forms when you learn to hide a part of yourself just to fit the moment. You start to notice it everywhere. At parties where the conversation shifts to basketball, and you feel your presence gently fading into the background. At family gatherings where the TV blares with commentary and excitement, and you find yourself drifting toward the kitchen or an empty hallway because sitting there makes you feel like an intruder in your own life. It's not that you dislike the sport, it's that you don't feel anything when others do. And that emptiness becomes its own heavy secret. Sometimes the shame arrives quietly, like a whisper you can't ignore. You wonder why you're different. You wonder if something is wrong with you for not sharing what everyone else seems naturally drawn to. You feel pressure to pretend to nod as if you understand the statistics, to smile as if you care about the outcome, to use words you don't emotionally connect with. And each small act of pretending becomes another layer of distance between you and your authentic self. The darker truth is that for some people, the aversion to sports began long before adulthood Maybe you were the child who was picked last, who felt the sting of being unwanted on a court that was supposed to be fun. Maybe you were mocked for not running fast enough, not shooting well enough, not being loud or confident enough. Those moments leave Mark's emotional fingerprints that stay long after the game ends. The court becomes a place of humiliation, the cheering becomes a memory of exclusion, and competition becomes a symbol of pain rather than joy. For others, the world of sports was connected to emotional instability, a parent whose mood changed with every game, a brother who used wins as power and losses as excuses. The arena roars, but inside, you hear only silence. You become a ghost at the edge of every celebration, someone who watches life unfold from just outside the circle. And this is how the shadow forms, through avoidance that feels protective, through difference that feels dangerous, through a kind of loneliness that grows whenever the world celebrates without you. But shadows don't form alone. They are shaped by something far larger, a society that decides what passions are acceptable and what differences are strange. Have you ever paused and wondered why something as simple as not watching a sport can make you feel out of place, as if you've violated some unwritten rule? It's strange how a game, just a game, becomes a measure of belonging. Yet from childhood onward, the world teaches you that basketball isn't just entertainment, it's a cultural heartbeat, a ritual, a shared language you're expected to know by instinct. And when you don't, the silence inside you feels louder than the cheering crowd. You grew up watching classrooms erupt over highlight reels, teachers using sports metaphors as if everyone should understand them, and playground hierarchies built around who could dribble, shoot, or shout the loudest. Even if you were a quiet child who preferred books or solitary worlds, society gently and sometimes harshly suggested that there was something more valuable, more admirable, about those who lived through motion rather than imagination. You learned early that normal kids love sports, and if you don't, you must be standing somewhere outside the invisible circle. As you got older, the conditioning deepened. Commercials, movies, and cultural traditions send the same message. Basketball is passion, unity, masculinity, confidence, energy, life. You see fathers and sons bonding over games, friends planning entire evenings around watching a match, co-workers connecting over shared victories and defeats. And even if you're not consciously comparing yourself, a part of you feels the subtle pressure, a whisper that says, you should be part of this. Everyone else is. But your mind, shaped by its own quiet architecture, resists becoming part of anything simply because it's expected. There's a quiet rebellion inside you, a desire to choose your identity rather than inherit it. While the world chases spectacle, you chase meaning. While others feel alive in crowds, you feel more yourself in solitude. It's not rejection, it's alignment. Nietzsche would call it the refusal to join the herd. Jung would say it's the beginning of individuation, the courageous, sometimes lonely task of becoming who you truly are instead of who society tells you to be. Yet even this inner strength doesn't erase the ache. Because society has a way of turning differences into distances. When you admit you don't watch basketball, conversations can stumble, energy shifts, subtle judgments flicker in people's eyes. You don't mean to disconnect, but the world often treats your difference as a missing piece rather than a different pattern. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you begin to feel less connected, as if there's a running joke you don't quite understand. And that feeling, that quiet ache of standing close yet never fully fitting becomes the emotional toll you carry, the weight that shapes the next chapter of your story. Have you ever sat among people you care about and felt something inside you slowly drift away, like a small boat pulled from shore by a tide no one else seems to feel? It happens in moments so ordinary they almost go unnoticed. a group of friends laughing over a game you didn't watch, a family gathering where the television glows with a sport you've never connected to, a conversation that circles around players and scores while your thoughts wander to quieter places. And in those moments, you become the quiet seat at the loudest table, present in body but distant in spirit. There's a strange ache that forms in that distance. You don't resent anyone's excitement, you just don't share it. And that difference creates an invisible boundary between you and the people around you. You try to smile, to nod, to follow along, but you feel like an echo instead of a voice. And the more these moments repeat, the more you begin to pull back, not because you want to be alone, but because withdrawing feels safer than pretending. You start avoiding certain conversations, certain gatherings, certain environments where you know the rhythm of the room will swallow your silence. Over time, the emotional toll deepens. You begin to feel misunderstood, as if there is a part of you the world can't quite see. You watch others bond over shared passion, shared language, shared energy, and you wonder why your heart doesn't light up in the same way. The world cheers, and you wonder why you've never felt the spark. It's not jealousy, it's longing. Longing for connection that doesn't require you to betray the quiet nature of your inner world. Sometimes, you internalize the difference as shame. You ask yourself why you aren't normal, why something so simple feels so foreign. You wonder if you're missing a piece everyone else was given at birth. You crave closeness, but not if it means abandoning the parts of yourself that feel true. You want to belong, but not to a version of life that disconnects you from your own emotional landscape. And yet, despite the loneliness, there's a truth forming underneath the surface, a realization that your rhythm isn't wrong, just different. That your way of being isn't lacking. It's simply not aligned with the world's most common patterns. What you seek isn't permission to pretend, but understanding that honors who you are. And healing begins not when you force yourself into a game you were never meant to play, but when you learn to see the quiet architecture of your identity with compassion, a shift that leads toward the possibility of a different path, one built around truth rather than expectation. Have you ever wondered what life would feel like if you finally stopped trying to fit into spaces that were never built for you? There comes a moment, usually quiet, usually alone, when you realize that the ache you've carried isn't actually about basketball, or sports, or conversations you couldn't contribute to. It's about the years you spent believing that something in you was lacking simply because your rhythm did not match the world's loudest beat. And healing begins when you allow yourself to consider a possibility you've never been taught to consider. That you're not broken. You're simply wired differently. You start to see that your disinterest isn't a flaw, it's a fingerprint, a unique expression of temperament, psychology, lived experience, and emotional truth. The moment you stop judging it is the moment you feel the first breath of inner freedom. You no longer need to pretend enthusiasm to earn closeness. You no longer need to borrow passions to build connection. You realize you can build bridges through values, curiosity, kindness, depth, humor, instead of shared hobbies. The right people won't care whether you watched the game. They'll care that you show up honestly as yourself. Somewhere along the way, you'll notice your inner child resurfacing, the same child who once sat alone while others played, who felt safer in imagination than in noise. Instead of silencing them, you begin offering them what they never received: permission. Permission to be quiet. Permission to be different. Permission to belong to themselves. This gentle act of inner child work rewires old associations, transforming the shame of difference into the pride of individuality. You start reframing identity, shifting from "I don't fit in" to "I resonate differently." You create boundaries without guilt, choosing conversations and communities that nourish your mind instead of drain it. You seek environments where introspection isn't viewed as detachment, where curiosity isn't treated as weakness, where your silence isn't mistaken for absence but respected as depth. And slowly, the world stops feeling like a place you don't belong to and becomes a place you can shape. You learn that you don't need to force intensity into your bones. You don't need to mimic the excitement others radiate. You don't need to join the noise to prove your humanity. Your life becomes a garden that finally receives the right kind of water, not the mainstream rain everyone else grows under, but the gentle, deliberate nourishment that allows your kind of mind to bloom. And in this blooming, a truth rises quietly inside you, a truth that brings you to the final realization of this journey, where the story stops being about a sport and starts being about who you were always meant to become. Have you ever wondered why your heart never stirred at the sound of a roaring arena, even when everyone else seemed to come alive under its lights? There is a quiet truth most people never discover about themselves, the truth that not every soul is built to move with the rhythm of the crowd. Some minds are tuned to different frequencies, softer ones, deeper ones, the kind that don't rise with noise but expand in silence. And maybe that has always been you, even before you knew what it meant. You grow up believing that belonging must look like loudness, like cheering, like knowing the heroes everyone else knows. But as you step back and watch your own life unfold, you start to see something different in your nature. You notice how your thoughts gather in stillness, how your emotions unfold gently rather than explosively, how your mind observes moments rather than rushes through them. While the world celebrates motion, you celebrate meaning. While others chase adrenaline, you chase understanding. You were never detached, only different. Think of the child you once were, the one who watched others run toward the ball while you watched the sky, the patterns on the ground, the way light moved across the world. That child was not uninterested. They were attuned to a quieter magic, a different kind of life. The same child now lives in you, still searching for spaces where they don't have to pretend, where depth is not mistaken for distance, where silence is not mistaken for emptiness. And perhaps, somewhere along the journey, you began to believe that something was wrong with you for not feeling what others feel. But here is the truth that should have been whispered to you long ago. Some people are not built for noise. Some people are not meant to find themselves in stadiums or scoreboards. Their belonging lives in conversations under dim lights, in books that slow the mind, in thoughts that unfold like long winter nights. They find meaning not in collective euphoria, but in the delicate architecture of their inner world. The world will always cheer for the same heroes, but some souls are born to study the shadows instead of the scoreboard. Your rhythm was never supposed to match the crowd's rhythm. Your path was never meant to follow the shape of the arena. You were built for reflection, for observation, for the kind of depth that exists far from the spotlight. And as you return to the beginning of this journey, you realize something you always felt, but never named. You were never avoiding basketball. You were searching for a world that speaks your emotional language, a language that has been yours from the very start.